South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been meeting the U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House in the last hour. In a press briefing some minutes ago, Mr. Ramaphosa said he wants to reset the relationship between South Africa and the United States and to discuss several issues, including access to critical minerals. He emphasized that the two countries have to work together to boost two-way trade.
I'd also like to thank you for allowing your people to start discussions with us at the trade level. I mean, we are essentially here to reset the relationship between the United States and South Africa. We are long-standing partners in many ways. We've collaborated in many fields, in space issues, in energy and in trade, and we therefore need to reset that, particularly in the light of some of the announcements that you made on trade and investment. So we want to advance more trade between the two of us, two countries, and our people now have been empowered by yourself and by myself to start engaging, and we hope that we will be able to fuel that engagement during our talks. And we also want to discuss issues that have to do with how we promote further investments in both countries.
Now, on his part, the U.S. President Donald Trump confronted the South African president with the most contentious areas of dispute between the two countries, including Trump's, and we should point this out, Trump's false claims of a so-called white genocide. South Africa has repeatedly rejected that allegation that white people are being targeted disproportionately by crime. All right, then let's bring you up to speed with some of the latest developments in that meeting in the last hour. Nick Harper is joining us now from Washington, D.C. So, Nick, this was a drawn-out, seems fairly contentious, heated meeting between the two sides with constant rebuttals from the South African side on these false claims of widespread land seizures and so-called genocide. Walk us through the key outtakes here.
Yeah, that's right, Rama. It certainly was all of those things. A meeting lasting about 1 hour and 5 minutes. Tense at times, fractious at others. It started off very cordially. The two men were joking, speaking about the possibility of trade investment, speaking about golf and receiving golfing tips from one another. But then things changed in tone dramatically, and what we essentially saw here was an Oval Office ambush by the US President against the South African President. Donald Trump asked his staff to turn down the lights in the room, and he wheeled out a television and then showed a 4.5-minute video, really with clips pushing those unsubstantiated claims of white genocide. And then really what happened is he forced the South African president into a debate about this idea of white genocide. During that video as well, Donald Trump said that he was showing images of what he called burial sites of white South African farmers. He said there were about 1,000 in total. Then Cyril Ramaphosa had an opportunity to speak. Not much of an opportunity, it has to be said, but he pushed back against those claims of genocide. He admitted that there was criminality in South Africa, but he said it disproportionately targeted black South Africans. Donald Trump also defended his decision to allow white South Africans to have refugee status here in the United States. Just last week we saw about 50 white South Africans landing just outside of Washington, D.C. as part of this refugee resettlement program. Cyril Ramaphosa said that he hoped Donald Trump would listen to the voices of South Africa and get their answers and their perspective. But Donald Trump did listen to some of the South African voices because he himself had invited some white South Africans into the room, influential business leaders who then essentially backed up Donald Trump's claims by speaking about how their own family members had been attacked in their homes and how many of them lived in fear of violence on their farms.
Indeed. And now we also have Julie Shire on the line joining us from South Africa. So, Julie, South Africa's president head of this, he said he's aiming for a reset of bilateral ties with the United States. From his perspective, given what we've seen in the Oval Office in the last hour or so, what does that reset really look like?
Well, Rama, the thing is that, as Nick mentioned, this kind of felt, again, like a little ambush for the South African president. But President Ramaphosa is really going into the Oval Office and to America really to repair relations. And he is set on bringing in this divide and to explaining to President Donald Trump that South Africa is not what has been portrayed lately in the news. As Nick mentioned, this small group of Afrikaners that have arrived in America last week as refugees. There is indeed a huge and a massive number of crime committed in this country. It is a very violent country. But President Ramaphosa is really looking to push ahead and try and find the best deals he can for trade. This country has a huge unemployment problem. But now with these relations that have been strained and with all this ill-founded views that happen in South Africa and putting in maybe the blame on the Afrikaner side could potentially break the trust of investors who really want to come into this country and be able to find and aid this problem that South Africa has with unemployment and to try and boost trade and to boost its production and manufacturing, Rama.
Indeed, and just for our viewers to put a bit of context, a bit of numbers to this problem around farm murders that has come up repeatedly in the last hour in the Oval Office. Consider stats from, for example, AfriForum, which talks about farm murders, and South African Police Service data. 50 farm murders reported in 2022. Total murders reported in the country in that year around 25,181. So if my math is right, that's less than 0.01%. Essentially, of firm murders making up the overall number. Now, moving on to trade, though, Nick, the threat of this 31% tariff on any exports coming in from South Africa, with some exceptions, obviously, for minerals like PGM metals, that still hangs right over the head of any bilateral trade talks. What does this administration want to get in a deal with South Africa, and is there any intent to actually get a deal, and if so, on what conditions?
Well, Rama, it's not clear from the US side that they are in a hurry to do a deal with South Africa. Remember, Donald Trump put a pause on those reciprocal tariffs for South Africa. That's a 31% tariff on South African goods entering the United States. A 90-day pause. We're about halfway through that, heading towards a July 9th deadline. The idea is that countries around the world, including South Africa, have that time to try and do a deal. And as we know from President Ramaphosa, he said during that meeting, our real reason to be here is to foster trade and investment and grow our economy. He wants to remove those tariffs. He wants to do investment deals. He spoke about 22 South African companies who were invested here in the US, and he spoke about 600 US companies who were invested in South Africa. But often the US in these trade negotiations wants something in return. We've seen that in the past. And one of the main things that the Trump administration seems to want at this time is deals when it comes to minerals. And Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about that in the Oval Office. He said, we have critical minerals, so we can offer those, including rare earths. It's very similar in many ways to the deal that we saw with Ukraine, getting the opportunity to extract those rare earth minerals from Ukraine, the United States getting a hand on that. And I think that is something that potentially South Africa could offer. It is something that could be a concession to help win a reduction in that enormous tariff that, of course, they're trying to avoid coming into effect when we get to July the 9th.
Julie, on the trade front, what's South Africa hoping to get in terms of a trade deal that could potentially be better than the access that the country already had to the United States under AGOA?
So, Rama, I think what is very important to mention, and as Nick said, South Africa is endowed with all the minerals. But when it comes to AGOA, South Africa wants it renewed, but they want much more than just the AGOA. They obviously are looking for a deeper, more tailor-made trade and agreement. And what is important to mention, and I think we haven't also touched upon that, is that South Africa does its high-quality exports like citrus, wine, grapes. But on the other side of the pitch, there's also energy. And this is where it gets kind of serious, because South Africa's supplies are kind of running low in Mozambique, in its neighboring country. And officials are keen to bring in the U.S. when it comes to maybe exploring the supply of gas for South Africa. And there's also very much a potential to find special zones for the American companies and to help facilitate these companies coming into South Africa to be able to operate in South Africa.
One last question for you, Julie, before I wrap up. The finance minister was also fairly busy today, presenting that revised budget for the third time to legislators. What were the key changes, and might the ministry be third time lucky in getting it approved by legislators this time round?
Yeah, Rama, you hit it exactly where it is, a third time lucky. And as we see, and we will see soon in a story that I have filed, the finance minister did cut on non-essential spending, and he has pushed harder on tax revenue and made room for energy and infrastructure. And obviously this ties in with the push that South Africa is trying to bring ahead with a deal, possibly with the U.S. And so the opposition parties are not completely convinced about this budget 3.0, but it does seem as if it's going to pass, Rama.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being and get updates a little later in the hour. Nick Harper joining us in Washington, D.C., and Julie Shire joining us here from South Africa. Thank you very much.